Visit Gyeongbokgung Palace in Seoul today, and you will see something interesting. Visitors from all over the world walk through the palace wearing colorful hanbok, bright skirts, elegant jackets, embroidered robes, and traditional hats. And hanbok is not worn only by tourists. Modern Korean women still wear beautifully designed hanbok for weddings, celebrations, cultural events, and photography. Some follow traditional designs. Others use modern colors, fabrics, and styles. For many people around the world, these beautiful images are what first come to mind when they hear the word hanbok. Korean historical dramas have strengthened that image. Millions of viewers have seen kings in magnificent robes, noblemen in black hats, queens and court ladies in elaborate dresses, and women in brilliantly colored skirts. The costumes are beautiful. But here is a simple question. Did Koreans really dress like this? Fortunately, by the late 19th century, cameras had arrived in Korea. And this is what they actually recorded. Farmers, merchants, workers, women carrying children, people going to market, and ordinary families going about their daily lives. Suddenly, hanbok looks rather different from the colorful clothing we see at Korean palaces today. For earlier periods, of course, there were no photographs. So historians rely on surviving garments, written records, paintings, tomb murals, and other historical evidence. And these sources reveal something important. There was never just one hanbok. Joseon was a Confucian society. Rank mattered, ceremony mattered, and clothing could tell people who you were and what kind of occasion you were attending. The royal court developed extremely elaborate rules about clothing, but we do not need to learn all of them. Let's look at just a few representative examples. This is one of the most familiar images of a Joseon king. The king is wearing a ganyongpa or dragon robe. This was an official robe associated with the regular business of government. On his head is an ikseungwan, a black royal cap distinguished by two wing-shaped projections at the back. Around his waist is an okdae, a jade-decorated belt. And on his feet are boots called wa. But look closely at his chest. The circular emblem is called a yongbo or dragon insignia. Even the dragon could communicate royal rank. In the later Joseon royal dress system, the king used a 5-clawed dragon. The crown prince used 4. And the crown prince's heir used 3. So sometimes, simply looking at the dragon could tell you something about a royal man's position. But even a king did not wear the same clothing for every occasion. 4 major state rituals and the highest royal ceremonies. He could wear a much more elaborate ceremonial costume called myeonbok. The most striking feature was the myeonnyagwan. This ceremonial crown had strings of beads hanging from it. The contrast is easy to see. One form of dress belonged to the regular official duties of the king. The other belonged to the highest levels of royal ceremony. The queen also dressed according to occasion. For everyday private life, her basic clothing still included a jacket and skirt. Within the court, a dangyi could be worn as a relatively less formal ceremonial garment. Royal women could distinguish their dangyi with special insignia and gold decoration. For the highest royal ceremonies, the queen could wear the much more elaborate juji. So even inside the royal family, there was no single outfit called royal hanbok. The same principle applied to government officials. Their official robes could carry embroidered rank badges. Cranes were associated with civil officials. Tigers were associated with military officials. And a military official did not necessarily look like a soldier in armor. When serving as a government official at court, he could wear formal robes similar in overall structure to those of other officials. Look at the badge on his chest. That small image could tell you a great deal. In Joseon, clothing could function almost like a visual language. But of course, only a tiny fraction of Koreans lived inside the royal palace. So let's step outside. At the upper levels of Joseon society were the yangban, the traditional elite class. A yangban gentleman might wear a long outer robe and the distinctive black hat known as a gat. But being yangban did not mean dressing extravagantly every day. Confucian scholars could appear in surprisingly simple clothing. Plain robes could express ideals of modesty, learning, and self-discipline rather than wealth or official power. And once we move beyond the royal family, government officials, and elite society, things become much harder to classify. A merchant did not always wear a special merchant costume. A farmer did not always wear a special farmer costume. Nor can we reliably identify every craftsman, servant, laborer, or other ordinary person simply by looking at the clothes in an old picture. So instead of trying to put everyone into a social category, let's look at the people themselves. Here are men working in the fields. Some roll up their sleeves. Some adjust their trousers for physical work. Others carry loads or work with tools. And look at the women. Their clothing was not simply something beautiful to look at. They carried water, worked around the house, went to market, washed clothes, carried goods, and raised children. Paintings by artists such as Kim Hong-do and other painters give us glimpses of this everyday world. By the late 19th century, photographs give us an even closer look. Now we can see individual faces. We can see how jackets actually sat on the body, how trousers were tied, how skirts fell around the legs, how people wore their hair, and how clothing changed when people had work to do. For most Koreans, clothing had a very practical job. People had to work in it, walk in it, sit on the floor in it, carry children in it, and live their everyday lives in it. Hanbok was not created to be displayed in a museum. It was clothing people actually lived in. So how old is Hanbok? That sounds like a simple question. But there is no single moment when Hanbok suddenly appeared. Some of the earliest surviving images of Korea's long clothing traditions can be found in Goguryeo tomb murals dating back more than 1500 years. The clothing does not look exactly like modern Hanbok, nor should we expect it to. Clothing changes. And Korea was never culturally isolated. For centuries, Korean clothing interacted with the clothing cultures of neighboring regions, especially China. Royal and official dress could be particularly influenced by Chinese systems of court clothing and ceremony. Early Korean clothing can therefore sometimes look surprisingly similar to clothing seen elsewhere in East Asia. But influence does not mean that clothing remained unchanged. Styles continued to develop within Korea. And women's clothing during the Joseon period provides one of the clearest examples. Look at these changing silhouettes. In the 16th century, the jugori, the upper garment, was relatively long and loose. During the 17th century, it became shorter. By the 18th century, the proportions had changed noticeably. And by the 19th century, the transformation was dramatic. The jugori had become remarkably short. The skirt was worn much higher. And the lower half of the body became fuller and more voluminous. The proportions of the sleeves also changed along with the jacket. Compare the 16th century figure with the 19th century figure. They belong to the same Korean clothing tradition. Yet they look remarkably different. And by late Joseon, the combination of a very short jacket and a high, full skirt had produced a silhouette that became increasingly distinctive in Korean women's dress. This does not mean that Korean and Chinese clothing can be separated by one simple rule. Chinese clothing was changing too. But over the centuries, Korean fashions developed their own increasingly recognizable forms. That is why searching for one original Hanbok can be misleading. Hanbok was not invented at one particular moment. It evolved. Clothing was not the only thing that could tell people something about you. Your hair could do the same. For centuries, unmarried boys and girls commonly wore their long hair braided down the back. A ribbon called a daengji could be tied at the end. For men, entering adulthood brought a major change. The long hair could be gathered and tied into a top knot called a sangtu. Coming-of-age ceremonies and marriage were closely connected with this transition into adult life. Women also changed their hairstyles after marriage, depending on the period and social setting. Married women wore their hair up in different ways, and fashion could make those hairstyles increasingly elaborate. In late Joseon, wealthy and fashionable women sometimes used gache, additional hairpieces, to make their hairstyles larger. In Korean, the old expression, to put one's hair up, even became associated with entering married adult life. And the male top knot leads us naturally to one of the most recognizable objects in Korean fashion, the got. The got is probably one of the most recognizable pieces of traditional Korean men's clothing today. Historical dramas have made it famous again around the world. But the got becomes much more interesting when we look closely. It was made with highly specialized craftsmanship. Horsehair was used in important parts of the hat. Very thin bamboo elements could also be used. The result could be remarkably light and almost transparent. And the got did not always look the same. It followed fashion. Its height changed. Its shape changed. And especially the width of the brim changed. At certain times, very wide brims became fashionable. Some surviving 18th and 19th century examples measure around 70 centimeters across. But a got was not simply placed on someone's head. Underneath it was the song too. The top knot we saw earlier. Around the head was a fine horsehair headband called a mangun. The mangun helped keep the hair neat around the top knot. Then the got was worn over this carefully arranged hairstyle. A fine got could be delicate and valuable, so people made special cases to protect them. They were called got jeep. Literally, a house for the got. A hat important enough to have a house of its own. Now let's look at something we often overlook. What were all these clothes actually made from? 4 materials are especially useful for understanding traditional Korean clothing: silk, rami, and cotton. Silk began with something very small, a silkworm cocoon. The fine fibers from the cocoon were processed into silk thread and woven into fabric. Silk was expensive and was widely associated with wealthy households, elites, and ceremonial clothing. For ordinary people, plant fibers were extremely important. This is hemp. The plant was harvested for its long stems. But a plant does not become clothing simply by cutting it down. The stems had to be processed. Fibers had to be separated. They had to be prepared and joined into thread. And finally, the thread had to be woven. The resulting cloth was called sambe. Rami required similarly painstaking work. The plant was harvested. Fibers were extracted from the stems. The fibers were split into extremely fine strands. Those strands were joined by hand. And eventually they were woven on a loom. The finished cloth was called mochi. It could be remarkably fine, light, and cool. Ideal for hot Korean summers. And then there was cotton. Today cotton seems completely ordinary. But cotton cloth was not always widely available in Korea. Before cotton cultivation became widespread, many ordinary Koreans depended heavily on hemp and rami, while fine silk fabrics were much more expensive. A major change came in the late 14th century. Moon Ik-jum brought cotton seeds back from Yuan, China. As cultivation and textile production spread, cotton became increasingly important in Korean life. Cotton was softer than hemp. And cotton did something else that was extremely important in a country with cold winters. It provided padding. Cotton-filled clothing could keep people much warmer. So the arrival and spread of cotton was not simply a change in fashion. It changed everyday life. And look again at old photographs of Korea. White and pale clothing appears everywhere. Many fabrics were worn undyed or in relatively light colors. Dyeing required additional materials, labor, and expense. Light-colored clothing also became deeply established in Korean dress culture. That helps explain why Korea in old photographs can sometimes appear almost overwhelmingly white. From the outside, a woman's hanbok can look relatively simple. A jugori on top, a large skirt below. But underneath that skirt, things could become surprisingly complicated. Women could wear several layers of undergarments. There were undertrousers and other lower body garments. There were also underjackets beneath the outer jugori. The exact combination depended on period, social status, season, and occasion. So there was no single universal set of underwear worn by every Joseon woman. But one thing is clear. The large outer skirt could be only the final visible layer of a much more complicated system underneath. Those layers could also affect the shape and volume of the outer skirt. And this matters because women's fashion changed dramatically during the Joseon period. As we saw earlier, the jugori became shorter. The skirt rose higher. And the overall silhouette changed. Hanbok, just like clothing everywhere else, had fashion trends. Which brings us to the women of late Joseon. By late Joseon, women's clothing had developed a striking style of its own. And it was certainly not always white. Paintings show women wearing many different combinations of color. A brightly colored skirt could be paired with a contrasting jugori, green, yellow, pink, blue, red. Subtle combinations and bold combinations both appear. The choice of color, fabric, decoration, and accessories could vary with age, wealth, occasion, social setting, and fashion. Fashion mattered. So did silhouette. The short jugori emphasized the upper body. The skirt began high and expanded dramatically below it. The result was very different from women's clothing several centuries earlier. But clothing was only one part of fashion. Hair mattered too. Married women wore their hair up in a variety of styles. Among wealthy and fashionable women, gache, additional hairpieces, could create elaborate hairstyles. Some became enormous and expensive. Hair ornaments and jewelry added even more decoration. Beauty, taste, fashion, and wealth could all be displayed through appearance. In that sense, people in Joseon were not so different from us. But women's clothing from this period also presents something that can be surprising to modern viewers. Some photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show women wearing extremely short jugori, with their breasts exposed. Why? One famous explanation says that women who had given birth to sons displayed their breasts proudly as evidence that they had produced a male heir. That explanation has been repeated for many years. But historians have questioned whether it can explain all of these photographs. Some of the women are carrying children. Others are working. Others are simply standing for the camera. Breastfeeding, work, social class, fashion, and the practical way clothing was worn may all have been part of a more complicated picture. And then comes an interesting contrast. When women went outside, covering the face and body could also become important. Some women wore a jangoti over the head. Others used the sugechima, a skirt-like covering worn over the head and around the face. So within the same broad period, we can find images that seem surprisingly revealing to modern eyes, and others in which women are almost completely covered. By the late 19th century, another major change was beginning. Western-style clothing was entering Korea. At first, the old and the new existed side by side. In early photographs, we can see people wearing traditional Korean clothing standing next to others in Western suits. Sometimes the two styles were even mixed. A man might wear traditional Korean clothing with a Western-style hat. Another might wear a Western jacket while keeping elements of traditional dress. For a while, Korea's streets became a meeting place of two different clothing cultures. But as the 20th century progressed, the balance gradually changed. Modern schools expanded. A modern military developed. Offices and factories became increasingly important parts of everyday life. Cities grew. Western-style suits, shirts, dresses, and uniforms became more common. Then came Japanese colonial rule, liberation, the Korean War, rapid industrialization, and urbanization. Each generation of photographs tells the story. In the early 20th century, Hanbok was still everywhere. By the middle of the century, Hanbok and Western clothing commonly appeared together. And by the 1960s and 1970s, Western-style clothing was becoming the normal choice for everyday life. Gradually, something that had filled Korean streets for centuries became less common. Hanbok did not vanish, but its role was changing. The clothing Koreans had once worn every day was becoming what we now call traditional clothing. So where did Hanbok go? It did not disappear. Instead, it found a different place in Korean life. Today, Koreans normally wear Western-style clothing in everyday life. But Hanbok still appears when an occasion carries special meaning. On Seollal, the Lunar New Year, some families wear Hanbok. The same is true during Chuseok, Korea's autumn harvest holiday. Hanbok also remains closely connected with weddings. At a modern Korean wedding, the bride and groom may wear Western-style wedding clothes for the main ceremony, and Hanbok for a traditional ceremony or family celebration. Children also wear Hanbok for their dole, the celebration of a child's first birthday. And Hanbok appears at cultural events, traditional performances, festivals, and important family occasions. But Hanbok itself has not stopped changing. Designers continue to reinterpret it. Some modern versions preserve the traditional silhouette. Others shorten it, simplify it, or combine it with contemporary fashion. And there is another place where Hanbok has found a surprisingly lively new role: Korea's old palaces. Every day, visitors from Korea and around the world put on Hanbok and walk through the gates of Gyeongbokgung. Which brings us back to where our story began. At the beginning, we asked a simple question: did Koreans really dress like this? After everything we have seen, the answer is not simply yes or no. There was never one single Hanbok worn by every Korean. A king dressed differently from a farmer. A government official dressed differently from a scholar. And even the same king wore different clothes for everyday government business and for a major state ceremony. Men and women dressed differently. Young and old dressed differently. Clothing changed with marriage, season, wealth, occupation, and occasion. Materials changed. Fashions changed. Hairstyles changed. Even the got changed. And all of this continued to change over centuries. So the Hanbok we see today is not a costume that has remained frozen and unchanged since ancient times. It is the modern expression of a clothing tradition that has been evolving for centuries. And perhaps that is why the scene at Gyeongbokgung Palace today is so interesting. The people wearing Hanbok may be Korean. They may be visitors from another country. The colors may be brighter. The designs may be modern, and nobody is dressed this way because they have to be. They wear it because they want to experience something connected to Korea's past. Hanbok is no longer what Koreans wear every day, but it has not disappeared. It has simply found a new place in Korean life. Korea presented.